manuscript before going on submission phase. I wrote a YA sci-fi that's Jane Eyre in space. So, love researching nerdy things. I'm gonna let each panelist introduce themselves and say a little bit about your book and one major thing you had to do a lot of research for any of your books, whatever that might be.
Do you want to start? Let's start with that.
Yes, let's change that.
That's like, oh, I thought I was going to have time. Okay, fine. My name is Mary Elizabeth, and I wrote Trust Me, I'm Lying and Trust Me, I'm Trouble. It's a series about a teenage con artist. And as for what research I had to do, there, it turns out, is a lot of information in the world out there about how to lie, cheat, and steal. So it wasn't too hard to find out that stuff. But one thing that I did that was actually kind of a fun way to research is I wanted to find out how to get to scam a free coffee out of a coffee shop. And it just so happens that my wife worked at Starbucks for like 5 years, way in the past. But anyway, I asked her, how would I do it? And she told me how to do it, and I did it, and it worked. I totally got a free coffee out of it.
You have to tell us, oh,
Yeah.
So you're really just like affirming whether or not I'm right in my head.
You probably are. It's a lot. It's always simpler than you think it is, too. But you just start talking to them, strike up a conversation, you know, while you order your drink, and then they go start making your drink before you pay, and then you pretend to have forgotten your wallet, and they're like, well, I just have to throw the drink out, so they usually give it to you, because they're like selling the coffee shop experience and the customer service more than they're even selling the drink.
Don't be criminals, please.
If you want to be, you can read the book. There's a lot.
Are you aspiring criminal
It
mind?
pays for selling coffee.
Yeah, so, you know, on the ground, boots on the ground research is a good thing. Like, you can learn a lot.
Now I just want to like run over to the vending room and like also go to the Starbucks in the lobby and just double check.
Hi, I am Robyn Schneider. I'm the author of The Beginning of Everything and Extraordinary Means. And what did I have to do for research? Okay, so in The Beginning of Everything, it started because I had like come across that story about Fabio getting hit in the face with a bird on a roller coaster. And like one thing led to another, and I was writing a book about a high school debate team. And actually, yeah, and so, like I think I was drawing a lot from my own like life experience in that book, but then in my second one, which is about teens who have an incurable and totally non-existent drug-resistant form of tuberculosis, and who were at a sanatorium in like the last days before the cure. I was in grad school for biomedical ethics, so I started like pulling and doing a lot of research since I had access to like a huge medical library and archive. So I was like I was reading like tuberculosis nurse manuals, like from like the 1930s, from like Germany. Like I was going crazy. I did a ton of research on that, which was mostly history of TB, like actual treatments, and then representation in literature.
How is that roller coaster? By the way, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yes, please talk about this roller coaster.
It's Apollo's Chariot at Busch Gardens.
Yes, and it was the
Colonial
first
Williamsburg.
ride. And
It's my favorite roller coaster of all time.
Is
too.
it?
And every time I go on, I'm like, oh, God. I hope you don't get hit in the face by a bird.
well, what happened was there was the woman dressed as like a Grecian goddess behind him, and like they took all these paparazzi pictures, and you see got him in the face of the bird, and there's blood and feathers. You see this woman in the photo behind him, splattered in his blood, in a Grecian gown, looking horrified. And I'm like, she had such a weird day. And so that was like one of the characters in my book was the kid who sat behind like the situation and became like forever known.
They hit him at such a high speed. He hit the bird at such a high speed, the bird like exploded.
But it just broke his nose. It was like fine.
Sarah, I'm gonna go to Wikipedia right now.
That's an amazing mental image. I've never looked at the person behind him. I've always just been struck.
Okay, if you pull up the photo, look at the girl. She's like, oh. Amazing. I was like, that's my book character.
I'm sorry, go back.
This is a great thing to follow up with. I cannot top this. So my name is Beth Revis, and growing up, I really, really hated science and would do anything I could do to avoid it because science had math, and I also really hate math. So my first book is science fiction. I mean, there is space and shit. So we got real.
So I did have to catch up a lot on the science side of it. But I guess if I had to pick one thing, the best research I did was I have in my third book, one of my characters leaves the spaceship without a spacesuit, which is inadvisable. And I had to figure out like what it felt like because he's narrating it and he had to describe like how it felt to not die in space for like 30 seconds. And unfortunately, my number one go-to resource for my research was NASA. And NASA is really considerate and they don't want their astronauts to die and have not thrown anyone out into the void of space. But unfortunately, Russia. Rely heavily on Google Translate, but the Russians were kind of like, what does happen? And they had many suits malfunction. And the poor cosmonauts, I mean, we laughed. Like, I don't think anyone died, but they probably just drunk it off later. But I had to go through all the Russian archives to find out what it feels like, and it's not pleasant because this is the panel this has become. What happens when you go outside of space? You have roughly a minute, give or take half a minute, which is really bad math there. And so when you go outside of space, if you've ever seen a sci-fi television show where they like suck in a big lungful of air and then get flung out in space, don't do that. Television has lied to you. If you do that, your lungs will pop like balloons. So instant death. So the thing you have to do if you ever find yourself in a situation, the thing you have to do is blow out all your air. So it's actually very fortunate if you scream like a little girl. If you scream in panic, you're in a good spot already. So blow out all your air, and the first thing that's going to happen is all the water in your mouth will evaporate, and it feels like your tongue is boiling. That's your first sign that things aren't going well. All your vision will turn red as all the blood vessels in your eyes pop. You'll survive mostly, probably you'll still be able to see. And then after that, all of the water will start to evaporate out of your skin, so get inside very fast.
It's like the opposite of what happens to Sailor Moon. Right? It's like not ribbons, not glowing sparkles.
Yeah.
Your hair doesn't look like a maypole.
Yeah.
Who would have thought Japanese anime would lead us wrong?
Oh, that's amazing.
How to follow that? I'm Alex Bracken. I'm the author of the Darkest Mind series and Passenger, which is my research, very intensive book because it is all time travel and history. So I researched everything from what shoes they'd be wearing to the hardest thing of all, which was like the layout of the actual ships they would be on, because fun fact, they only kept records of like ship plans for the big warships and not for really any of the commercial merchantman ships. In case you decide you want to write a pirate book one day, good luck. Godspeed, my friends. Like what they've been eating, and then I got to get into alternate history and its sequels. So it's been really fun. I just have done a lot of historical research lately, so I cannot comment on science like that. I do am not a science person. That's why my time travel is
Mine is so science grounded. Like I remember researching like, okay, so what are the emerging technologies now, what we can do to like track people's like blood pressure and heart rate, and how would that be applied? And how would that be applied like, you know, in like an alternate present where we do have this technology, but we would have wanted to develop it quicker because we have this epidemic that's spreading, as you know. That sounds like my nightmare.
I had to do some science research for the Darkest Minds, and it was like, Jesus, take the wheel. And my poor friend who's in med school, yeah, she was in med school at the time, was like, okay, take my hand.
I was going to ask you guys, the ones that do science, so where do you find this info? How do you do this research, especially when you're not science? You're a science person, Robyn.
Yeah,
But
I have a medical degree, yes.
You do.
I don't
in
think
case
you
you
do.
need a resource.
They really did not want to give it to me.
Alex or Beth?
I rely heavily on the fiction side of science fiction. So I researched enough to know why we don't have the thing that I need in my future. So for example, across the university, it opens off with a girl being cryogenically frozen. And one of the reasons we don't have that is when we get cryogenically frozen, the membranes in our cells burst with ice crystals, and we basically become freezer burned meat. And that does come quite well. Even the Russians haven't figured out how to fix this. So I just researched enough to know that the ice crystals burst the membranes, and then I invented a blue goo that they get injected with, and the blue goo solves the problem. Yay, fiction!
Amazing.
Yes.
The blue goo is in vodka.
As I was writing. So one of the fun things about being a sci-fi writer is that NASA is really, really involved with science fiction writers, which is really cool because I've gotten to go on private tours at the Houston. Yeah, it's awesome, right? Space sci-fi. So I got to do a private tour of the International Space Station training module where the astronauts actually train, and it's like the life-size, full-size module, and like we had to wait for the astronauts to finish before we could go in. So that was really cool. And I was like fangirling the whole time. And it's really interesting because, you know, there's the European and American and Japanese side, and then there's the Russian side. And like everyone works together, and it's like clean and white and chrome and pretty. And then there's the Russians. And it looks like it's from the 70s, y'all. It's all beige carpet. All around. Carpet everywhere, beige, matte, furry carpet. And there's these weird little cubby holes, because especially the Japanese side where they have more of the science modules, like everything was labeled and glass panels were gorgeous. And then the Russians are just like, here's a random cubby hole behind the carpet. And so I was asking the NASA person, I was like, why? And she was like, well, we tell them they can't have vodka, but they bring the vodka. There are hidden carpet compartments throughout the Russian module where they just store their liquor.
To know what happens when you go out in space.
Exactly.
With a spacesuit on, so they need a vodka. Everyone else is like, it's anyone's guess. Maybe it'll be Sailor Moon.
This is the same cosmonaut program that used to send their cosmonauts up with a pistol in case things went bad. So they're not exactly optimistic. I know, the Russians, God bless.
Well, related, how important is accurate science in science fiction? And for any of you who has bad science ever thrown you off a book? Like, you can't read it. Everyone has one. We all have one. We're like,
Well, I feel like my knowledge of science isn't, like, an author can get away with a lot. Like, unless there's a total breakdown of logic, I'm pretty willing to be like, yeah, that sounds like plausible, maybe. So I'm not the right person to answer this question.
Well, I think it's like, you know how sometimes you have like scenes in movies where like the author like gets a book deal and like walks their hard copy manuscript into their editor's office and sits there while like the editor reads it, you know, like Romancing the Stone, I think, like started this. But like, you know, that kind of a thing. And I'm like, this is so not how it is. And like, this is so obvious. It's not like you have to read the New England Journal of Medicine to figure out the minutiae of like cell death or something. So, you know, I kind of give a lot of things a pass because I'm like, well, they don't need to be realistic if they like work in the story.
Yeah.
But then again, for myself, I'm so hard on myself. Like, I'm still terrified that like there is a CDC tuberculosis specialist out there who's going to read my YA romance novel and like, you know, and publish like an angry article bullet pointing all the inaccuracies despite my graduate research on the subject. Like, and then I'm going to be like, oh my god, I never even knew how embarrassingly wrong I was. Like, every day I really do wake up with this like burning fear that there is like some double doctorate out there who's going to stumble across my teen book and like school me.
If it makes you feel better, it's not the end of the world when it happens. It happened to me with a senior person in my publishing house. And he worked in the nonfiction department, and he sent me an email that was like, I read your book because it came out from our publishing house, and this is wrong. And so I just wrote back and was like, it's fiction. I put a little smiley face on it, and
One thing I did not know before I read it was that The Martian was published online, and he constantly had people fact-checking for it. Because when I read that book, I was like, oh my god, did he fact-check every single bit of science in this book?
oh, the NASA engineers used some of it now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they used it for some of their future missions.
That's amazing. Anyway, sorry, tangent. Again.
Yeah.
No, not
It's totally monster.
like
Sorry.
research and stuff. So what about beyond science? What are other like deep dives you've done, and how do you approach them, including like deep dive into real life, but a real life thing that isn't you? How do you approach that sort of research and writing? Mary Elizabeth.
Well, I think I go through phases where I will research something to death and then like not write, you know, and that I sort of have to bring myself back from those like moments. And then there are times when I'm like really into the writing, and so I'll just really quickly grab a fact from somewhere, you know. So I'm kind of always researching even while I'm drafting, and I think that you know it's a good method for, because a lot of the research that we do will never even make it in, you know. So you do have to kind of research with that in mind of like, okay, I need to know, you know, how to make a fake license using diffractive film and varnish and like all this other stuff, but that's never going to actually make it into the book, you know. So I just need to know enough to not get it completely wrong. So you know, be okay with that. But yeah, I mean, I've done, you know, deep dives on. Right now, I'm writing a book on illegal street racing, and so if you want to know about that, I can tell you a lot about that.
I feel like you're a bad influence.
It
started with coffee and now
Yes, yeah,
That's an
dangerous.
escalation.
Yes.
Yeah, it's highly dangerous. But you know, you can find subject matter experts on anything, and they love to talk about what they love, like NASA. You know, like they're like, heck yeah, if you buy me dinner, I will totally spill my guts of like my 15 years worth of knowledge of being in this industry. So that's always a good way to go, I think.
Does anyone else use experts? Like, get them, you know, you get them drunk and you talk to them?
No, that would be totally fun. I'm afraid of people. Like a Google Scholar, like I can handle. Like I can, but like a human being, like I feel like I'm just like mining their life for my own personal gain and like
But
doing
you're
it to their
laughing.
face.
And you can make them in the acknowledgements.
We had a totally different aspect, because when you started talking, it's like, I know, right? I just don't leave the house with pants on. So like the face stuff, I'm like, ooh, that's outside, not on my couch.
Well, I mean, like, so people knew I was writing a book about tuberculosis, so everyone, like, knew how excited I got, so they would, like, save tuberculosis stories for me. So that's the thing. It's like Marilee has a really good one. But, like, there was somebody at Writer's House who accidentally contracted drug-resistant TB, and, yeah, anyway. So the whole agency had to be, like, tested. They had, like, the CDC come in and, like, stick everybody in, and the guy was so embarrassed, and, like, yeah. Anyway, he, like, got it living in Brooklyn. Is a total hipster. I don't even know what happened. But so everyone brings you story. If you've like put out feelers, like, hey, I'm writing a book about like this. I'm writing a book that has tuberculosis in it. People, like your friends, will like go out and like kind of search, and then they'll like bring you your thing, and they'll be like, I have a story for you, or have you seen this, or have you seen that? And like that was really helpful for me because it was like the crowdsource.
Yeah, and my experts are friends of friends. Like they're not like
You're not like cold emailing.
Yeah, no. Yeah, no, I'm not going out to like, you know, Outlaws Street, whatever, and like, you know, like, ooh, I could Google and find that guy's email address. No, these are like friends of friends. So I mean, again, bad influence. I guess I have really bad friends, but yeah, interesting friends. But you know, so or friends who have friends, and they just, like you said, it just totally works for you. If you talk about your book and talk about what you're interested in, other people will be like, ooh, I know something about that, or I know somebody who knows something about that, and then they'll hook you up. It's that easy.
My first instinct is to always retreat to books, to the point that I like didn't even think to ask my grandmother, who's traveled really extensively across the world, if she had been to some of the places that I was trying to write about that I had never been to, and she had, and I found this out like 3 days ago, around January, so I was like, well, maybe I should think about trying to ask actual experts about things instead of just going to the books and scholarly journals.
So is that how you do your historical research? I'm curious about how you approach that.
Yes, has anyone in college right now, does anyone use JSTOR? JSTOR is my jam. I used to go on JSTOR just to read scholarly articles for people.
I did that too, and Google Scholar is the one they recommended in grad school because I was a JSTOR girl, and they're like, no, you gotta go to Google Scholar now. And I was like, what?
I don't know how I feel about that. I feel very loyal to JSTOR.
Me too.
So I went to school at William & Mary, which is the second oldest school in the country, and I tell you this because I discovered when I was 17 years old that I had a totally normal fascination with 18th century America. Like, really just connected hardcore with 18th century America. And I grew up in Arizona, so I had no reason to like have really gotten to know this very well, because in Arizona, you're very focused on West Coast history versus East Coast history. And during APO's history, APUSH, I was like, wow, this is so interesting, like all the personalities, and I want to study early American history in school. So I went to William & Mary, which is at one end of Colonial Williamsburg. Has anyone been to Colonial Williamsburg before?
Yes, many times.
Yeah. Oh my god, that makes me happy. Colonial Williamsburg on the West Coast. So you know, it's like 18th century reenactment. And the college is literally at one end of 18th century Williamsburg. And those reenactors are like ride or die 18th century America. They have all of the same inside jokes. Like, they don't break character until you see them in Wawa buying their lunch. They're like, alone. So walking around Colonial Williamsburg really felt to me like traveling back in time, and that's sort of where the seed of Passenger came from. And originally Passenger was only going to be set in modern New York City and in 1776 New York City around the British invasion, or British, when they took control of it, basically, during the Revolution pretty early on. But I really wanted to challenge myself and research different cultures and on different continents, and so on and so forth. So it kind of became a treasure hunt for history and across the world. But I felt really comfortable writing in Nicholas's voice. He's 18th century, former slave. I don't know. It was just like such an interesting experience. I'm sure you guys can relate to this. To be in a completely different character's head and have to really deep dive into research and reading first-person accounts and narratives and journals and diaries to kind of get a sense of who they are. I felt like I may be a more empathetic person too. Yeah.
Oh, I was gonna say my favorite part of your book was the parts of it in London, because you had one character who, this is not both, goes into the past and one who goes into their future.
Yeah.
And I love that because I've always kind of like wanted Doctor Who to do something where you have like a time traveling companion who's like Victorian and goes forward to like the swinging 60s, and they're like, this is the future, but for the viewer it's not. Right, well, like modern Who.
Well,
Classic Who, yeah.
Classic Who has
Classic
that.
Who has it, but like, I wanted like modern Who to do that, and like anyway, it was very exciting. Like when your book did, because I was like, hey, thanks, dude. I was like, yeah, this is my wish fulfillment. And so you're reading a book, you're like, no, don't do that. No, don't go there. Stop it. And I was like, yes.
I love fish out of water scenarios too. I really like testing characters in completely like different experiences than what they ever could expect or imagine, which I think makes for interesting conflicts. But one of the fascinating things about doing the research for Passenger was trying to anticipate how Nicholas as a black man would be treated in different historical periods and how he would feel in those specific periods and places, and then how Etta, who's a modern New York teen, would feel going into the past and being subjected to different century standards. That was fun research too.
Yeah. It was interesting to me also that Nicholas didn't immediately want to go into the future. Because we tend to think like, oh, our civilization is perfect and everyone wants to be here, but not always.
No. I'm pretty sure that the only group of people that would have a great time traveling are like white dudes.
Yeah.
Like,
Too sad.
actually going into the far future, which I would be curious about going into the future because I love spoilers. But
I would love it if white dudes went into the future and it was like not for them.
yes.
Yes. H.G. Wells in that book.
Did they do that?
He ends up in a matriarchal society in the future where it's all women.
Oh, I didn't mean matriarchal. I mean like just like everything.
That must be like a cautionary tale.
Like they try to make it like,
I just remember that really bad movie. Yeah, it's sticking in my head. But no, my first book, which I shelved, but it was time travel, and I had to research a real person and write a real person in my book. Jane Austen. Different Jane. So I read
Tuberculosis.
my character meets Jane Austen. There you go. So I read multiple biographies, and then I read all her letters to get a sense of her voice, to think about, because she's not like the characters in her books.
But other than that, I was too scared to send it to my history professors to be like, can you tell me what I got wrong?
I'm scared of it sometimes. Like, so when I wrote the beginning of everything, I gave it to a friend of mine who was like kind of big in the like nerd fighter fandom. And I was like, hey, just like, I think I wrote this book for people who are like really geeky and enthusiastic, and will you read it and tell me if it's something you like? And she like hated it. She was like, I don't think you're allowed to write this book. She's like, you stole this, like blah, blah, blah. Like somebody who's like a prominent like YouTuber retumbled something about this. And I'm like, that's Foucault's panopticon. You learn it in college in every English class you take. Like it's not like a thing. And she just like went on, and she was like, this book feels stolen, like, and I was like, oh my God. And I had given it to my agent too, and I was like waiting, and I spent really the first year the book was out waiting for the internet to like vilify me overnight. And I ran into this person again, and she's like, I love your book, I'm so excited for it. And I was like, you destroyed me. Like, I had never allowed myself to have a beta reader again. I almost scrapped my career. Like, I was so terrified, and she doesn't even remember that she gave me this feedback. And so sometimes, I don't know, I feel like if you've written something that you're proud of and happy about. Like that said, like I was not writing largely outside of my experience, like racially or anything like that. So, I mean, I was writing a like crippled boy, but like, she wasn't reading it for that. But yeah, it was horrifying. And like, I've only really heard people give like great like stories about, oh my God, my beta readers were so awesome. And I almost walked away. Like, I was humiliated. Like, I've never had somebody, like, read me like that before. And she had no recollection that she had done it.
Wow. Yeah, I have found that, especially if you get a beta read from somebody who's not an author.
Yeah, not an author.
As an author, the most important thing to us is story first. Story, even about, like, I write science fiction, story above the science. Like, story comes first. And people who aren't always authors, and they feel like they're focusing in on the science part as opposed to the fiction part, and they tear apart the stuff that doesn't need to be torn apart. So
yes, and then when you're like, well, what specifically about this wasn't working for you? And they're like, oh, I don't know.
Yeah.
Just nothing, the whole book, just tear it apart. It's just like, I don't know. I don't mean to be so grim, but like sometimes like when you think that like, you're expecting a reaction, it might not be the reaction you get.
But what you said where you feel like you know when something's right or not, I think you do have to learn to trust your instinct and your gut.
Yeah, I think people who go out and get a sensitivity read know that they need to get a sensitivity read because like they've tried, but there might be a couple of things that have slipped past them, so they're like, okay, but like, I probably need a sensitivity read of what I'm writing next, which is like a bisexual narrator. And I'm so excited to write it, and I like wanted to write this book forever. And I'm just like really excited about that, but like I know in advance, like before I'm even like gonna finish the novel, like that I really want some people to like read it and like let me know. Versus I think the other one, I was just nervous that I didn't have belief in myself as a writer yet, as opposed to I didn't know what I believed about the story. And I think those are two different things. I think like your confidence. I think I might have been looking for validation. Like the book wasn't a POS, and like as opposed to like, is this sensitive like toward this experience of like disability or something? I think you can ask the wrong questions and get bad answers sometimes.
I would love to do Q&A. You guys ask your questions on the panel. You're there. You're like ready.
Okay. I had to say something with that is. Get a Ravenclaw to be your beta reader.
Slytherin.
Who's a Ravenclaw? Everyone else is on
If you tell them what you're looking for, they will read it specifically for that thing.
I think this is very good advice.
Oh, just a similar comment. One thing that I've generally noticed is if you've got a specific thing in mind, like if you're trying to amuse people with comedy, and the person who's reading it is in a really, really bad mood, they're probably not going to like it. And they might like it next week, but they didn't like it today. So when you're dealing with beta readers, it helps to say something like, this is supposed to be comedy, make sure you're in the mood for comedy.
Yeah, I think knowing like what people are in the mood to read, and also just like, not like just saying, do you like it? I think just asking two general questions as opposed to like specifics would really be a problem. Like, you know, like, is this too funny or is this not funny enough, as opposed to like, this is supposed to be funny? Because that would be my question, like, did you find the scene comedic? Just so that they know they need to be in the headspace of, is it funny or not?
Yeah. Grease, head garment.
Yes.
Beautiful.
So I love this story first idea, and I think that's very important. But as a creative person, I have sometimes experienced that using that as an excuse to not do research. And so I'm wondering, either personally or as an opinion of like what writers should do, where do you think is the line between like going along with your creativity and like trusting the story versus having like the discipline to actually do more and more research?
I have the opposite problem where I will procrastinate by doing a ton of research, and I will go into like Wikipedia black holes where like they just dig deeper and deeper, and you're like, this is fascinating. It has nothing to do with my book. But and my friend Susan Denner, who's here, you'll have to ask her about this. She like got so deep into figuring out the tides. She was like researching 15th century Venetian tides for like one scene in her book, and I was like, we are the same person.
You don't have to write the scene if you're still researching the scene. That's like the best part. Is it's like, I was very productive today. I wrote no words.
And for me, I will like give it my best shot. I will try really hard to find something. If I need to keep going and keep writing the story, I will like highlight and put like X and highlight it so I know I have to come back and fill in that detail. But another like rule I have is like if I can't disprove it, I can include it. Like if I can't disprove that this place existed here, then as long as it's like reasonable that there could be like a rest stop here, then yes, I can put a rest stop here.
For me, like, and this is partly as a reader, it's logic. The logic has to hold up. So do enough research, I think you said it, to know what is not possible or why it's not possible. And so I know as a reader, you're nodding, like a book that doesn't have good science throws you off. The one that gets me is Earth Science in dystopias. A lot of dystopia writers don't research Earth science, and they're like, it's the future and the polar ice caps have melted and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, wrong, that is inaccurate. That would not happen, and then I can't finish the book. I think everyone should do a modicum of research so that the logic holds.
I'm good friends with Carrie Ryan, who wrote The Forest of Hands and Teeth, which is a fascinating zombie love story.
It is.
And she describes it as everybody gets a certain amount of gimme points. So, like in hers, she was like, straight off the bat, we have zombies, and so those don't exist, so you have to suspend your disbelief for that. So I have to make sure these other things work. So like in my science fiction, we don't have faster than light speed travel, but I mean, I just have them going fast enough to get to another place. You just give that's how Star Wars works, that's how Star Trek works. You get that one, but that means the other aspects need to be more accurate. So you have a few that you can flub.
That's great advice.
Yeah, and if anyone does this,
I stole it from really bad.
that reminds me of Blake Schneider Saves a Cat. He has a thing called double mumbo jumbo or something like that, where it's like if you have multiple like magical or wackadoodle premises, that's when stories will start to fall apart. When you have too many things that you have to suspend your disbelief on. So
Yes, like they have to be related. It's not like, gravity has disappeared and there's vampires. Unless you need like the vampires, it needs to be like the vampires built in anti-gravity. They just float toward you in the air and their capes look really sexy. Yeah.
That'd be such a frustrating existence as a vampire.
We'll just about to aisle, and then I'll get you to come back, and then we'll come back for it.
Lack of gravity.
I was wondering if you guys could talk about fiction research that you had to do. So, like with, as a bad example, vampires or maybe time travel, where you have to go back and research how other fiction writers have handled those things.
Yes, I did for con artists for sure. I watched The Sting, which was awesome, by the way. Great movie, and I learned a lot about con artists from that. And how they sort of like double cross each other, and like all kinds of good stuff comes from. And actually my whole idea for the book came from watching Leverage and White Collar back to back. And I was like, man, I really want to read a YA book about that. So I wrote one. Yeah, so I definitely think that's important because you also kind of don't want to reinvent the wheel, you know, if somebody else, or if a lot of other people have done it, it's like a trope as opposed to, you know, a unique spin on an idea maybe that's gone before. So, yeah, I definitely think that can be helpful. Also can be a shortcut. Like The Sting was a total shortcut for me in terms of terminology and things like that.
I did the opposite. Whenever I wrote Across the Universe, I had not started off writing a sci-fi, and then I needed cryogenic freezing, and then that led to a spaceship, and things snowballed. So I went into my bookstore, and I asked them for their latest young adult science fiction, and they handed me Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game. And I said, that's awesome. Can I have something that was published after I was born? They handed me Stephanie Meyer's The Host, and I said, that's great. I need a spaceship. And they didn't have anything. And so I had written the entire novel without really reading more than that. And I think in some ways that helped me because I wasn't as aware and worried about the tropes. And I just wrote the story I wanted to write. So sometimes it can help to go in blind.
Well, sometimes also knowing tropes but not writing in that field. Like my tuberculosis book is ostensibly a boarding school, even though it isn't. And I love boarding school fiction growing up. I wanted to go to boarding school and I read all of these books. So I started to see the patterns and then I was like, okay, well I'm not going to do that like in this book because it's this but it isn't. It's like a different, it's this plus something else. So, you know, in a boarding school book you have the trope of like the character's roommate shows them the ropes on the first day and they have a conveniently located like friend group that the character can sit with who, you know, does the exposition or whatever, and the new student in a boarding school trope, and I'm like, oh, well, I'm going to have this because they all are dying. They don't have roommates, and he doesn't find anybody to talk to, and there's like the wall of terrifying loneliness that hits, and you know, having to figure everything out and misstep on your own because there isn't that convenient BFF character with the friend group waiting for you. So sometimes, like, reading a lot of fiction that's doing something that you either are doing or don't want to do can kind of inform decisions that you want to make in your own story to have it stand out.
Robyn?
I just had a quick question about the sensitivity reading. I don't know if you guys have heard about the Magic in North America and all of the backlash and things like that, but do you think that when you're writing outside of your experience, that sensitivity reading, do you try to go into it with like the specific questions that you're talking about with beta readers, or do you just say, this is outside of my experience, so critique it all? And then also because there's so many different types, I mean, when you talk about Native Americans, for example, there's so many different types of tribes and things, so how do you kind of not go into the research like whole, like you said, of, you know, checking in with every, like, with the endless amounts of cultures that you don't know about, but also making sure that you are telling a story that is not going to offend or is not accurate to how the world works, as in a black woman won't be the national president in 1920 America, because that would never happen. So
I'm still working through my thoughts on the North American school. I'm like trying to articulate what I think, because on one hand I get what she was trying to do,
yeah.
But I think the key with sensitivity readers too is that like you have to understand the context of history. You have to understand like all of the events kind of leading up to it in order to understand why you are being insensitive. And I don't think she necessarily put in that work, did not kind of grow up in, she obviously did not grow up in this country. She did not know that this is, probably does not know that this has been like an ongoing debate and like a struggle for these tribes. And I don't know, for me, I was just like, I really need help with the emotional side of this. I feel like I have the facts down about what it was like for a former slave in 18th century America. I've done a ton of research. I've read journals, diaries, accounts, like scholarly journals. But if anything doesn't read true on the emotional front or on the experience front, like please let me know. And if you catch anything I missed, because he happened to also be a history teacher, so I was like, I messed something up. But I think it's like putting in work on your end, doing the best you possibly can, and then just not having any sort of ego and giving it to someone, or like just just accepting that you're coming from a privileged position.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. Like, we can research the facts as emotions.
Yeah.
That without having that experience, we cannot know.
And I think you have to know that you need a sensitivity reader, and God bless JKR, I don't think she realized. I just don't think she realized. Like, she didn't, and neither did a publisher, which is bizarre to me. I'm like, there's so many scholars that could reach out to. I digress. Yeah, and so if you don't know in the first place, you're not gonna reach out. So I think that's how those sorts of things happen.
Well, I think the amount of time you have to spend with like a book, and hopefully, like J.K. Rowling's story wasn't like something that took her years to do, but like the amount of time you spend in the headspace of like crafting a novel, researching a novel, and like being in the tight perspective of like characters and their emotional arc and their journey and their relationships. Like it's a story about a person, and that person can come from a culture different than yours, but you should have a very deep emotional connection to this character and their journey and your research and your need to spend a year of your life telling the story and revising the story and putting your name on it and putting it out into the world. And if you're in that place, like, and you're asking somebody like, hey, I've done all of this, but I know I could still do more. Could you, can you help and make sure that like what I've done doesn't have something that I've missed? Like, didn't like overlook a fact. I think, that's coming at it from like a really great place, and I think that is just what I assume most people who want a sensitivity reader are coming toward versus like a beta reader. It's more like, okay, is Act 2 wonky and too long and just confusing because the vampires are floating around? And I think like one is from a place of like wanting to do good, and one is from a place of wanting to write well. And I think those are just two like divergent questions.
I was just going to say everything they just said, especially the part about not having ego going into it. I think sometimes people get really attached to their privilege, and they get really attached to their ideas of themselves as a good person. But you can make a mistake without being a bad person. And I think if you know that as a writer going into asking somebody very humbly for a sensitivity reading, even just the parts that are important, like not wasting their time with necessarily a whole book, but just unless it's prevalent throughout the whole book. But that's really what it's about, is like being in the right frame of mind.
Okay, so it's kind of a two-parter. How do you avoid putting too much of your research into your book? And then on the other side is, if you do, because you love the material that you're researching, you're getting right into it, you can tell lots of stories with all of this information in it, how do you then cut it? And like, how do you determine how you cut the material?
So
you will always have to cut.
I have thoughts about this. Because I also don't like, getting rid of all of that, amazing information about how to make the IDs. Like, that is really important stuff people should know. Because you never know, you might be writing to the law. Or, mobsters or something. But I think that, like, what people do generally is that, story always has to come first, because people will just not finish a book if there's too much research that is not applicable to the story. You always have to go back to your logline. What is the story about? You always have to go back to your character. What are they really learning? What wound are they overcoming in this book? And if your research is not supporting that, then it needs to come out. But you can put that research into like supporting fun materials like fantastical beasts and where to find them. Like that. None of that information should ever have been in the Harry Potter books, other than like little snippets here and there as flavor. They're flavor details. But you can create a whole other book that's just that minutia for the people for the Ravenclaws who do want to read it. And then you can sell the hell out of that book. So you can just know that it's not dead. Just because you took it out of the story because it wasn't serving the purpose of the story doesn't mean that it is wasted. Like, you can still use it.
The story is character, plot, and world, and where I tend to put in the extra research that doesn't need to be there is the world. So if the only thing you have that's adding to it is world details, that needs to go. If your research needs to directly apply to the character or the plot, and if it doesn't directly apply to the character or plot, that's when it has to go.
Yeah, this is something that I feel like I've learned so much writing Passenger, and one of the things I learned was that no matter what, this is totally subjective by reader. Some people love the historical detail in Passenger, other people hate it and think it slows the story down. So for me, it was more important to make it feel like very immersive, so I skewed more on the side of like, yes, I will stop for a moment and tell you about like what this marketplace looks like and what the smells are like, and kind of try to make it immersive. It's sort of like what your goals are with writing the story too, but I agree, if it doesn't relate directly to like the actual plot or the character development, then that's a good sign that it can be cut.
So I think I heard it like shorthanded as tell readers what they need to know, not everything you know. And I thought like also having a separate document where you have all the world building in, and then you like take the highlights reel and put that in your book. You know, sometimes if you're just like writing like the world building into chapter 1 of your document and you're like not a plotter, you're a pantser, and you're like, here's my novel, it becomes hard to take it out because you feel like it's disappearing. But a lot of the time that's like your series Bible, and that's information that you need for yourself. Like you should always be able to answer any question that everyone has, but people should definitely still have questions about a world. And then like for me with the tuberculosis thing, my publisher made me put an author's note at the end of Extraordinary Beings. They were like, you have to tell people like how much this diverged from the actual history, and like what medications and like treatments and like facilities are real and are fake and are based on whatever. And I was like, do not make me do this. And I had to write like a 7-page like history of tuberculosis as it related to like how I used it in the novel at the end of the book. And I was like, nobody is going to want to read this. I was so wrong. There are so many like little Ravenclaw readers, and like all of the like, there's so many like Goodreads reviews that are like, the author's note is fascinating. I had no idea that like, I was like, okay, whatever.
We have time for one last question.
Oh, it's so hard. Are they quick?
Can you be quick?
We can give quick answers.
Try it.
Yes.
Yes. Well, I'll take both of you. So you first.
Okay, I don't know how quick it's gonna be. What process you guys have for your research? Like, where do you start? I guess. Does that make sense?
It depends on what I'm trying to learn. Like how to make fake IDs, you're probably not going to find that on Wikipedia. But so I had to get a book. But there is a book. And so that's awesome. But yeah, and then for like little flavor details, like I was talking about before, I might go to Wikipedia if it's something kind of factual, or if it's like, you know, human detail, I might ask a friend, you know, something like that.
I'd like to recommend Reddit. Google AMA, or just AMA and the thing you're looking for, and someone probably did a Reddit AMA on it. I have found some fantastic details on really random things. They'll do Ask Me Anythings on lots of things. Reddit's a great source for like first-person source where you don't have to actually talk to a human. It's great.
I sort of have the basics of the basic flow of the story outlined, and so for Passenger, it was really like, I want them to go here, here, and here. And before actually writing, I did a lot of research, and then as I was writing, I supplemented that research with smaller details.
I write as I go, and then when I get stuck, I research.
I research like in a hole like for days and days beforehand, and that way my brain starts making connections. I like call it my 3-type problem, and I like lock myself in a room like Sherlock Holmes does when he solves a case. And I just like go through so much research that I'm like spinning from it, and then I sit down and usually I see the story idea that I had differently, and it informs it differently. And then primary source documents, and then I just Google as I go.
Kind of bouncing off of that, you guys mentioned JSTOR and NASA and Wikipedia a lot for resources. What are some other great resources, particularly for historical research?
I don't know how late this is. If you go onto like your local university's website, a lot of websites, a lot of the like history professors who are teaching courses on it will have like scans of primary documents that are like on their pages for their students to download. So I've gotten a lot of information that way.
That's a great
And frankly,
it's not illegal for you. It's them who they get in trouble if they've done something, so you're fine.
They're not. I go through archives.org too a lot. I go through and look at photographs. Oh, this is like the most random thing ever, but if you're trying to write a description of a place you've never been before, go onto YouTube, and some tourist has probably filmed a video of them walking through
that side. That's how I could write the import. And I use Pinterest for fashion.
Yeah.
For like shoes and like, when I read the descriptions, Pinterest is great for historical fashion.
I find like students who publish like their college thesis paper on like I don't know, Victorian England representations, and then I go through and I read their bibliography and I see what sources they use, and then I Google and I can usually get summaries and be able to see what articles I want. But I love going through bibliographies of like of close reading papers, because that's really, really helpful to me. It's like somebody's already done the research for me and they spent like an entire year, and then I just like get it free in a minute.